The coffee shop buzzed with soft chatter, the smell of roasted beans mingling with the sweet aroma of pastries. Jasmine clutched her wallet, patiently waiting for the barista to call her name. Her long braid hung neatly over her shoulder, and her understated outfit, dark jeans, a crisp blouse, and sensible shoes, spoke of someone practical yet polished. Dean, however, couldn't help but see her as a target. The line had barely moved, but his irritation was already bubbling over. He was used to getting his way, whether through intimidation or charm, and right now, he didn't care who this woman was or why she was there. "Lady," he snapped again, his voice louder this time, drawing attention from other customers. "You're holding everybody up." Jasmine turned her head slightly, her expression calm, though her eyes hinted at something more, something watchful. "I've placed my order," she said softly. "Just waiting for it to be ready." Her tone wasn't defensive, but it wasn't apologetic either. It was even and firm, as if she didn't feel the need to justify herself. Dean wasn't used to that. Most people either scrambled to please him or shrank back in fear. He leaned closer, towering over her. "You think you're special or something," he said, his lip curling. "People like you always think the rules don't apply." The comment made a few heads turn. A middle-aged man near the pastry display frowned but said nothing, quickly looking away when Dean glanced in his direction. Jasmine didn't flinch. She simply adjusted her bag on her shoulder and glanced toward the counter, where the barista had just placed her cup. "That's me," she said, stepping forward to collect her drink. Dean stared after her, his jaw tightening. She hadn't argued, hadn't snapped back, and yet her calm response felt like a challenge, a reminder that he didn't control her. Jasmine stepped aside, allowing the next customer to order. She moved to a small table by the window, setting her cup down carefully. Outside, the morning sun cast a golden glow over the quiet street. Cars rolled by slowly, their drivers still half asleep, and a group of teenagers laughed as they passed on bicycles. She took a sip of her coffee, savoring the warmth. It was moments like these, ordinary, peaceful moments, that she cherished. But even as she enjoyed the calm, she was always aware of her surroundings. Jasmine had learned long ago to pay attention to the little things, a shift in tone, a look that lingered too long, a step too close. Dean, meanwhile, was still fuming. He grabbed his coffee and muttered something under his breath about people wasting his time. As he walked past Jasmine's table, he couldn't resist one last dig. "Next time, try not to hold up the whole world," he said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. Jasmine looked up at him, her expression unreadable. "Have a good day, officer," she replied, her voice steady. He froze for a split second. How did she know he was a cop? He wasn't in uniform, and there was nothing obvious that would give it away. His eyes narrowed as he tried to figure her out, but she had already returned her attention to her coffee, as if he was nothing more than a passing nuisance. Dean shook his head and walked out, muttering to himself. Outside, he climbed into his cruiser, the leather seat creaking beneath him. He took a deep breath, trying to shake off the strange encounter. It wasn't like him to let someone get under his skin, especially someone like her. Inside the coffee shop, Jasmine allowed herself a small smile. She hadn't meant to provoke him, but his type was easy to read: loud, overconfident, and quick to assume the worst about people. She had dealt with men like him before, and she knew better than to let their words affect her. But there was more to her calm demeanor than just experience. Jasmine Carter wasn't just anyone. She had worked hard to build a life she was proud of, and she wasn't about to let anyone, especially someone like Dean, shake her confidence. What Dean didn't know, and what no one in the coffee shop could have guessed, was that Jasmine wasn't just an ordinary woman. She had connections, deep and significant ones, and her life was far more complex than it appeared on the surface. Her husband, Richard Carter, was a man of considerable influence. But Jasmine never flaunted that fact. She preferred to stand on her own, to handle things her way. As she finished her coffee, she glanced at her phone. There was a text from Richard. "Hope your morning's going well. Call me when you have time. Love you." She smiled, typing a quick reply. "All good here. Love you too." Jasmine rose from her seat, placing her empty cup in the bin before heading out. The crisp air greeted her as she stepped onto the sidewalk. Life went on around her, but she had a feeling the day was far from over. Back in his cruiser, Dean tapped his fingers against the steering wheel, his mind still lingering on the brief encounter. Something about the woman bugged him, not just her calm demeanor but the way she seemed completely unfazed by his presence. Most people at least pretended to respect him, even if they didn't mean it. But she hadn't done either. As he drove through the neighborhood, his irritation began to fade, replaced by curiosity. Who was she? And how had she known he was a cop? The question nagged at him, and he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to her than met the eye. But Dean wasn't the kind of man to dwell on things for too long. He had a job to do, and he wasn't about to let some random woman distract him. Yet, as the day went on, he found himself replaying the interaction in his mind, wondering if he'd see her again and what he'd say if he did. Jasmine stood frozen for a moment, her hand lightly pressed against her cheek. The sharp sting was nothing compared to the disbelief that coursed through her. She hadn't expected the situation to spiral so quickly, but now she was the center of a scene she never asked for. The slap had drawn gasps from the gathering crowd. A mother holding her child covered her mouth, eyes wide in shock. An elderly man shook his head in disapproval, mumbling something about abuse of power. But even with witnesses, no one dared to step forward. The uniform, the flashing lights, and the loud voice of authority were enough to keep everyone at bay. Dean, however, showed no signs of regret. His chest puffed out, and his face was flushed with anger. "Maybe next time, you'll think twice before mouthing off to a cop," he sneered, his voice carrying over the murmurs of the onlookers. Jasmine didn't reply immediately. She lowered her hand from her face, her eyes locking onto his. There was no fear in her gaze, only a quiet strength that made Dean shift uncomfortably for a brief moment. The tension between them was thick, and even though the crowd watched intently, no one dared to break the silence. "I was in the crosswalk," Jasmine said calmly, her voice steady despite the obvious redness on her cheek. "You had no right to stop me. And you certainly had no right to hit me." Her words were measured, spoken with the kind of composure that only came from someone who knew her worth. Dean's smirk faltered for a second before he quickly recovered, doubling down on his authority. "You're lucky that's all you got," he barked, stepping closer, his towering frame meant to intimidate. "Keep running that mouth, and I'll take you in for resisting an officer." A murmur rippled through the crowd. People exchanged uneasy glances, unsure of what to do. One man in a business suit pulled out his phone, pointing it discreetly toward the scene. Another woman whispered to her friend, "This is too much. Someone needs to step in." But Jasmine didn't flinch. She stood her ground, her posture straight and dignified. "You've made a mistake," she said firmly, her eyes narrowing slightly. "A big one." Dean chuckled darkly, clearly unimpressed. "Oh yeah? And what are you gonna do about it? Call a lawyer?" He rolled his eyes dramatically, his arrogance on full display. Jasmine's lips pressed into a thin line, but she didn't respond. Instead, she calmly reached into her bag and pulled out her phone. Her fingers moved swiftly, dialing a number. Dean watched her with a mix of curiosity and annoyance, his hands resting on his hips. "Who are you calling?" he demanded, his voice dripping with condescension. "Your boyfriend? Your boss? Newsflash, lady, nobody's gonna save you now." Jasmine ignored him, her phone pressed to her ear. "Hello," she said, her tone polite but firm. "Yes, I need you to come down here immediately. There's been an incident." Dean frowned, his bravado dimming slightly. "What are you?" Before he could finish, Jasmine held up a finger, signaling for him to stop. The gesture was subtle but powerful, as if she was dismissing him entirely. Dean's jaw clenched, and his hand instinctively hovered near his belt, where his badge and radio were clipped. By now, the tension had escalated to the point where the air felt heavy. More people had stopped to watch, their faces a mix of curiosity and concern. The man with the phone continued recording, his expression serious. A teenage girl whispered to her friend, "Do you think she's someone important? She doesn't seem scared." "She's just standing there like she owns the place," her friend replied, shaking her head. "That guy's crazy." Dean noticed the murmurs, the shifting of the crowd, and the steady presence of phones pointed in his direction. His confidence wavered slightly. This wasn't the first time he had dealt with a situation like this, but something about this woman was different. She wasn't shouting or crying. She wasn't pleading for help. She was calm, almost unnervingly so, and it threw him off balance. "You'd better start explaining yourself," Dean snapped, trying to regain control. "Because I'm this close to slapping cuffs on you." Jasmine lowered her phone, her conversation finished. She slipped it back into her bag, her expression unreadable. "You've already done enough," she said simply. Her words were quiet, but they carried weight. Dean felt a prickle of unease, though he quickly buried it beneath a layer of bravado. "You think you're untouchable or something," he scoffed. "You think you're above the law." "No," Jasmine replied, her voice steady. "But you do." The statement hit harder than Dean expected. He opened his mouth to respond but found himself at a loss for words. The crowd murmured again, and for the first time, Dean realized just how many eyes were on him. His cheeks flushed, not with anger, but with something closer to embarrassment. Before Dean could say anything else, the sound of tires screeching brought everyone's attention to the street. A sleek black car pulled up to the curb, its windows tinted and its presence commanding. The door opened, and out stepped a tall man in a tailored suit. His movements were deliberate, his expression unreadable. He exuded authority, the kind that made people instinctively straighten their posture and hold their breath. Dean's eyes narrowed. "Who the hell is this?" he muttered, mostly to himself. The man didn't answer. He walked past the crowd, his gaze fixed on Jasmine. When he reached her, he placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, his eyes scanning her face for any sign of injury. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice calm but laced with concern. Jasmine nodded. "I'm fine, Richard," she said softly. Dean froze. The name hit him like a ton of bricks. Richard. Richard Carter. The name was legendary in law enforcement circles. Chief Richard Carter, his boss, the man who ran the department with an iron fist and a sharp mind. Jasmine looked at Dean then, her expression calm but pointed. "Officer Walters," she said, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "Allow me to introduce my husband." Dean's face went pale. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. His mind raced as he tried to process what was happening. This woman, the one he had insulted, threatened, and slapped, was married to the chief of police. Dean Walters stood in the middle of the sidewalk, his fists clenched, the heat of his anger rising to his face. He glanced around at the onlookers, their judgmental stares piercing his inflated ego. Some held their phones up, recording the scene. Others whispered to each other, their expressions ranging from shock to disgust. But no one dared to confront him directly. "She's lucky that's all she got," Dean muttered under his breath, loud enough for those closest to him to hear. His voice was filled with false confidence, his words meant to cover the growing unease bubbling in his chest. Jasmine Carter, however, wasn't fazed. She straightened her posture, brushing off invisible dust from her sleeve. Her calm demeanor only amplified the tension. She didn't shout, didn't scream, she didn't need to. Her silence was louder than any words she could have spoken. Her gaze locked onto Dean, steady and unyielding. There was no fear in her eyes, only a quiet, almost unnerving confidence. She tilted her head slightly, her expression softening into something that looked like pity. "You'll regret that," she said softly, her voice cutting through the murmurs of the crowd like a blade. Dean laughed, the sound hollow and forced. "Oh, yeah. And who's gonna make me? Your lawyer." His smirk widened, but deep down, a small voice in the back of his mind told him he'd made a mistake. Jasmine didn't flinch, didn't rise to his taunts. Instead, she calmly reached into her bag and pulled out her phone. The crowd, which had grown larger by the minute, fell silent, their curiosity piqued. What was she doing? Was she calling the police? Filing a complaint? Dean crossed his arms, trying to appear unfazed. "Go ahead," he sneered. "Call whoever you want. It won't change a thing." Jasmine pressed a single button on her phone, holding it to her ear. When the line connected, her tone was low and steady, yet commanding. "It's time," she said simply. The words were spoken with an air of finality, as if they carried a weight that Dean couldn't quite understand. She ended the call as quickly as she'd made it, sliding the phone back into her bag. Without another word, she turned on her heel and began walking away, her head held high. The crowd parted for her like the sea, their eyes following her every step. Whispers rippled through the group. "Who is she?" a young woman asked her friend, clutching her phone tightly. "I don't know," the friend replied, her voice filled with awe. "But she doesn't seem scared at all." Dean watched her go, his confusion mixing with frustration. "Hey," he called after her, his voice sharp. "I'm not done with you." But Jasmine didn't stop. She didn't even look back. She walked away with the same calm, measured steps she'd entered with, leaving Dean standing there, seething. The murmurs around him grew louder. Dean could feel their stares, their judgment. He turned to the man closest to him, who had been recording the entire encounter. "Put that phone away," Dean barked, his voice dripping with authority. The man hesitated but didn't lower his phone. "This is wrong," he said quietly, his words filled with more courage than Dean had expected. "You can't just hit someone like that." Dean's jaw tightened. "Do you want to spend the night in jail for interfering with police business?" he snapped, taking a step closer. The man faltered, lowering his phone slightly. I wasn't interfering," he stammered, backing away. Satisfied, Dean turned his attention back to the crowd. "All right, show's over," he barked, waving his hands. "Get back to whatever you were doing." The crowd slowly began to disperse, though many left reluctantly, throwing him lingering glances of disapproval. Dean tried to shake off the unease that was creeping into his chest. He was used to being in control, used to people fearing him. But something about this situation felt different. He climbed back into his cruiser, slamming the door shut. For a moment, he sat in silence, gripping the steering wheel tightly. The woman's words echoed in his mind. "You'll regret that." Meanwhile, Jasmine walked calmly down the street, her heels clicking softly against the pavement. She wasn't in a hurry. She didn't need to be. She had made her call, and now it was only a matter of time. She glanced down at her phone, which buzzed with a new message. Opening it, she read the words. "On my way. Stay where you are." A small smile played on her lips as she typed a quick reply. "I'm fine. He doesn't know who I am yet." She slipped the phone back into her bag and continued walking, her thoughts focused and clear. She had encountered men like Dean before, men who thought their authority gave them the right to bully and intimidate. But Jasmine knew better. She knew that true power didn't come from a badge or a uniform. It came from something deeper, something unshakable. As she reached a small park bench, she sat down and crossed her legs, taking a moment to enjoy the quiet. The leaves on the trees rustled gently in the breeze, and the sound of children laughing in the distance filled the air. For a moment, it was as if nothing had happened at all. But Jasmine knew this was only the beginning. Back in his cruiser, Dean was starting to feel the weight of the situation. He couldn't shake the image of Jasmine's calm, unflinching gaze. She wasn't like the other people he'd dealt with, those who shouted or cried, those who begged for leniency. She was different. He drummed his fingers on the steering wheel, glancing at the dashboard clock. It had only been a few minutes since she'd walked away, but the memory of her parting words lingered in his mind. It's time. What did she mean by that? He muttered to himself, his brow furrowing. The radio crackled, pulling him from his thoughts. All units, we've got a report of a disturbance on Main Street. Possible altercation between two individuals. Witnesses report a uniformed officer involved. Please advise. Dean's stomach dropped. He knew exactly what the call was about. Grabbing the radio, he barked, Unit 12 here. No need for backup. Situation's under control. There was a pause on the other end before the dispatcher responded. Copy that, Unit 12. Proceed with caution. Dean sighed heavily, tossing the radio onto the passenger seat. His grip on the steering wheel tightened. This was bad. He could feel it in his gut. And yet, he couldn't bring himself to admit that he might have gone too far. Jasmine didn't have to wait long. The sleek black car pulled up in front of the park bench where she sat, its engine purring softly. The door opened, and out stepped a man with a commanding presence. He was tall and impeccably dressed, his tailored suit emphasizing his broad shoulders and confident posture. Jasmine rose to greet him, her expression calm but warm. You're fast, she said. The man smiled, though his eyes were serious. You know I don't waste time when it comes to you. Jasmine gestured toward the direction she'd come from. He's still there. Probably trying to figure out what just happened. The man's jaw tightened. Let's make sure he figures it out quickly. Dean Walters woke up the next morning feeling invincible. The events of the previous day barely registered as a concern. In his mind, the woman he had slapped was just another face in the crowd, someone who would rant and rave, maybe file a complaint, and then disappear like all the others. Dean believed he had nothing to fear. He was untouchable. After all, he wore the badge. Whistling to himself, he got dressed, pulling on his crisp uniform and carefully pinning his badge to his chest. The mirror reflected a man who thought he had complete control over his world. He adjusted his hat, smirked, and headed out the door. By the time he reached the police station, the bustling energy of the morning shift was in full swing. Officers greeted each other, phones rang, and paperwork piled up on desks. Dean strutted through the station, nodding at his colleagues, his arrogance practically radiating off him. To him, today was just another day of asserting his authority and reminding people who was in charge. Walters, a voice boomed from across the room. It was Captain Harris, his tone sharp and commanding. Dean turned, his smirk fading slightly at the captain's expression. Harris wasn't smiling. In fact, his face was unreadable, a rare occurrence for the usually approachable man. Yes, sir. Dean replied, straightening his posture. Chief Carter wants to see you in his office. Now. Dean's stomach dropped slightly, but he quickly masked it with a confident grin. Sure thing, he said, forcing an easy tone. What's this about? Harris didn't answer. He simply turned and walked away, leaving Dean to make his way to the chief's office alone. As Dean approached the large wooden door marked with Chief Richard Carter, a faint unease began to creep into his chest. It was unusual for the chief to call anyone indirectly. Most matters were handled by the captain or lieutenants. Still, Dean brushed off the feeling. Whatever it was, he'd handle it. He always did. Knocking twice, he waited until he heard the deep voice from inside. "Come in." Dean pushed the door open, stepping inside with his usual swagger. "You wanted to see me, sir," he began, his tone casual. But then he saw them. Behind a large oak desk sat Chief Richard Carter, his expression unreadable but his presence commanding as always. The chief was a tall, imposing man with silver hair and sharp eyes that seemed to pierce through anyone who stood before him. Dean immediately straightened, his confidence faltering slightly. But it wasn't the chief that made Dean's heart skip a beat. Standing beside him was Jasmine. Dean froze. His mind raced as he tried to process what he was seeing. Jasmine stood there, calm and composed, her hands resting gently at her sides. She wasn't wearing the casual clothes from the day before. Instead, she wore a tailored dress, her hair neatly styled. She looked every bit the part of someone important, someone powerful. What's she doing here?" Dean stammered, his voice cracking slightly. The room felt heavy with tension. The chief leaned forward, resting his hands on the desk. His sharp gaze bore into Dean. "She's my wife," he said, his tone cold and deliberate. The words hit Dean like a freight train. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. He blinked rapidly, his brain struggling to catch up with what he'd just heard. Your wife," he finally managed to choke out. "Yes," the chief said firmly, his voice like steel. "Jasmine Carter. My wife." Dean's knees felt weak. He tried to speak, to explain, to justify, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, his mind flooded with memories of the previous day, the slap, the threats, the way he had dismissed her so casually. He remembered her calm response, her measured tone. "You'll regret that." And now, he understood exactly what she had meant. I didn't know," Dean stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. Jasmine's steady gaze didn't waver. "Does it matter?" she asked softly, her tone carrying an edge that cut through him like a knife. "Would you have acted differently if you'd known who I was?" Dean's head snapped up. He opened his mouth to protest, to claim that it did matter, that he wasn't that kind of person. But the truth hung in the air, undeniable. He had judged her, dismissed her based on nothing more than his own arrogance. "I didn't," he started, but the chief cut him off. "Stop," Carter said, his voice firm. "You're not going to talk your way out of this." The chief leaned back in his chair, his eyes never leaving Dean. "Do you know what I value most in this department?" he asked, his tone deceptively calm. Dean swallowed hard. "Respect," he guessed, his voice shaking slightly. "Accountability," Carter corrected, his voice rising slightly. "The ability to own your actions and face the consequences. Something you clearly lack." Dean shifted uncomfortably. He felt like a child being scolded, and it was a feeling he wasn't used to. He had always considered himself untouchable, but now he realized just how wrong he had been. "Sir," Dean began, but Carter cut him off again. "Enough," the chief said sharply. "Do you think I don't know what you've been doing? The complaints? The accusations? Do you think your badge gives you the right to treat people however you want?" Dean's face burned with shame. He wanted to deny it, to defend himself, but he knew it would only make things worse. Dean hesitated, his voice barely audible. "I made a mistake." "A mistake?" Jasmine's voice was soft but firm, cutting through the tension like a blade. "Is that what you call it? A mistake?" Dean turned to her, his eyes pleading. "I didn't mean to." "You didn't mean to what?" she interrupted, her calm demeanor unshaken. You didn't mean to abuse your power? To humiliate me in front of a crowd? Or did you simply not mean to get caught? Her words were like a slap to the face, each one hitting harder than the last. Dean couldn't meet her gaze. He looked down at the floor, his confidence shattered. Chief Carter stood, towering over the desk as he addressed Dean. "Here's what's going to happen," he said, his voice leaving no room for argument. "You're suspended effective immediately. There will be an internal investigation into your conduct, and if it's determined that you've violated department policies, and I have no doubt that you have, you will be terminated." Dean's eyes widened in panic. "Sir, please. This isn't a negotiation," Carter said firmly. "You've crossed a line, and now you're going to face the consequences." Jasmine remained silent, her presence a constant reminder of Dean's actions. Her calm, steady gaze never wavered, and it was clear that she wouldn't be swayed by apologies or excuses. Dean left the chief's office in a daze, his mind racing. As he walked through the station, he could feel the eyes of his colleagues on him. Some looked at him with pity, others with disdain. The weight of their judgment pressed down on him, making every step feel heavier than the last. He had always thought of himself as untouchable, but now he realized just how wrong he had been. The day after Dean's suspension, the news began to spread like wildfire through the department. Whispers of what had happened filled every corner of the police station. Officers huddled in groups, discussing the shocking turn of events. Some were surprised, others said they had seen it coming. Dean Walters had always been a controversial figure, loud, arrogant, and often too rough in his interactions with civilians. Now, his actions had finally caught up with him. Dean sat in his small apartment, staring blankly at the paperwork in front of him. It was the official notice of his suspension. His badge, once a source of pride, now felt like a weight he couldn't bear to look at. It sat on the table, reflecting the dim light of the room. For the first time in years, Dean felt powerless. The investigation had begun immediately. Witnesses were interviewed, and video footage from the incident was reviewed. The evidence against him was overwhelming. Dean's reputation, already fragile among some of his colleagues, was now completely destroyed. No one wanted to associate with him, and the officers who had once admired his bravado now distanced themselves, afraid of being tainted by his downfall. The media caught wind of the story, further amplifying the damage. News outlets ran headlines like, "Officer suspended after public altercation with chief's wife." "Abuse of power, how one cop's actions sparked a movement." Dean's name was plastered across every screen, and the comments were brutal. Online forums and social media were flooded with opinions, many condemning his behavior. Dean tried to avoid reading them, but the words haunted him nonetheless. Good riddance. People like him shouldn't wear a badge. Finally, some justice. For the first time, Dean was forced to confront the reality of his actions. He thought back to all the times he had thrown his weight around, all the people he had dismissed or mistreated. He had always justified it to himself, believing that his authority gave him the right to act as he pleased. But now, sitting alone in his apartment, he realized how wrong he had been. While Dean faced the consequences of his actions, Jasmine was already working to turn the incident into something meaningful. She had no intention of letting the moment pass without creating real change. Quietly but firmly, she began to use her voice to advocate for accountability and fairness within the police department. At first, Jasmine hesitated. She had never been one to seek the spotlight, preferring to work behind the scenes. But the incident with Dean had shown her that staying silent wasn't an option. Too many people had suffered at the hands of unchecked authority, and she couldn't let it continue. With her husband's full support, Jasmine attended meetings with department leaders, sharing her perspective and offering suggestions for improvement. She spoke about the importance of treating civilians with respect and the need for officers to understand the impact of their actions. Her calm demeanor and thoughtful approach earned her the respect of many, even those who had initially dismissed her as just the chief's wife. Jasmine also met with community leaders, listening to their concerns and gathering stories of others who had experienced similar mistreatment. She organized workshops and training sessions for officers, focusing on empathy, communication, and de-escalation techniques. Her goal was simple: to create a culture where officers were held accountable for their actions and where the community could feel safe and respected. Over time, Jasmine's efforts began to make a difference. The department implemented new policies, including stricter guidelines for officer conduct and a clearer process for handling complaints. Officers were required to attend regular training sessions, and a new oversight committee was established to ensure transparency and fairness. The community, too, rallied behind Jasmine. Her story resonated with many, and people admired her strength and determination. She became a symbol of resilience and hope, proving that one person could make a difference. Local newspapers ran headlines like, "Chief's Wife Leads Effort for Police Reform." Jasmine Carter, the woman who stood up for justice. Community members reached out to her, thanking her for her efforts and sharing their own experiences. Jasmine listened to each story with compassion, using them as motivation to continue her work. One day, a young woman approached Jasmine after a community meeting. Her voice trembled as she spoke. "I just wanted to say thank you," she said. "What you're doing means so much. People like me, we've been afraid to speak up for so long. But now, I feel like maybe things can change." Jasmine smiled warmly, placing a hand on the woman's shoulder. "They will," she said. "But it's not just me. It's all of us working together." As for Dean, his suspension eventually turned into termination. The investigation concluded that his actions were not only a violation of department policy but also a gross abuse of power. He was stripped of his badge and barred from working in law enforcement again. Dean struggled to adjust to life outside the force. He had built his identity around being a cop, and without the uniform, he felt lost. Jobs were hard to come by. His tarnished reputation followed him wherever he went. Employers were hesitant to hire someone whose name had been tied to such a public scandal. For months, Dean drifted, moving from one low-paying job to another. He avoided his former colleagues and rarely left his apartment. The once confident man who had strutted into the police station every morning was now a shadow of his former self. But the lesson, though harsh, was one Dean could never forget. He realized too late that the power he had abused was a privilege, not a right. The people he had mistreated weren't beneath him, they were human beings deserving of respect. And the woman he had dismissed so easily had turned out to be someone far more powerful than he could have imagined. Jasmine's work didn't stop with the police department. Inspired by the impact she had made, she expanded her efforts, working with other organizations to promote justice and accountability on a larger scale. She spoke at conferences, participated in panel discussions, and even helped draft legislation aimed at improving police-community relations. Through it all, Jasmine remained humble. She didn't seek recognition or praise, she simply wanted to make a difference. And as the years passed, her efforts continued to bear fruit, creating a legacy that would outlast her. As for Dean, his story served as a cautionary tale, a reminder of what could happen when power was abused and respect was disregarded. He faded into obscurity, but his actions had sparked a movement that brought about real change. In the end, justice was served, not just for Jasmine but for the countless others who had endured similar injustices. And though the road had been difficult, it was a path worth taking, proving that even in the face of adversity, change was always possible. Sometimes, it's the quiet ones who hold the most power. Jasmine Carter was one of those people. She didn't raise her voice or throw insults. She didn't need to. Her strength wasn't in loud words or dramatic actions, it was in her calm presence and her unwavering belief in what was right. Jasmine knew that power didn't come from shouting the loudest or intimidating others. True power came from standing firm in your values and letting the truth shine through. She understood that respect wasn't something people should have to fight for, it was something they deserved simply because they were human. Jasmine's story didn't just change the way one police department operated. It sparked conversations across the entire town and even beyond. People began to question how authority figures treated those they were supposed to protect. Her quiet determination inspired others to stand up against injustice in their own ways. Schools began teaching about respect and accountability in their curriculums. Community leaders invited Jasmine to speak at events, where she shared her experience and encouraged others to remain strong in the face of adversity. Her message was simple but powerful. Speak your truth. Stand tall. The world can't ignore you when you know your worth. One by one, people started sharing their own stories of mistreatment. Jasmine listened patiently to each one, offering advice and hope. She reminded them that even in their quietest moments, they held power. She often told them, silence isn't weakness. Sometimes, it's the calm before a storm of change. Dean's downfall became a reminder of what happens when respect is ignored. His name became a cautionary tale, a story parents told their children when teaching them about the importance of treating everyone equally. While Dean had once thought his badge made him untouchable, he learned the hard way that no one is above accountability. The incident also taught people that appearances can be deceiving. To Dean, Jasmine had seemed like just another ordinary woman, someone easy to overlook. But Jasmine's grace and quiet strength revealed a deeper truth: you never know who someone really is or who they're connected to until it's too late. It wasn't just her connection to her husband, Chief Richard Carter, that gave her power. It was her character, her wisdom, and her unshakable resolve. These were the qualities that truly made her powerful. The town began to feel different after Jasmine's story unfolded. There was a shift in the air, a renewed sense of accountability. Officers treated people with more care, knowing that their actions would be scrutinized not just by their superiors but by the community they served. Jasmine's workshops became a cornerstone of police training, focusing on empathy, de-escalation, and respect. Officers were encouraged to see the people they interacted with as individuals, not just as problems to solve. The change wasn't immediate, but it was steady. Slowly, trust began to rebuild between the police and the community. Jasmine, too, grew from the experience. Though she had always been strong, the incident taught her just how much of an impact she could make when she stood up for what was right. She realized that her quiet strength could inspire others to find their voices. She also found a deeper appreciation for her relationship with Richard. Through it all, he had stood by her, not as a protective husband but as an equal partner who respected her decisions. Together, they became a symbol of unity and integrity within the community. As for Dean, his life took a different path. The months following his termination were some of the hardest he had ever faced. For a long time, he was angry at Jasmine, at the chief, at the world. But eventually, he began to look inward. One day, while flipping through the news, he saw a story about Jasmine's advocacy work. She was being interviewed about her efforts to improve police-community relations. She spoke with the same calm confidence he had witnessed that day on the street. For the first time, Dean saw her not as the woman who had brought him down, but as someone who had taught him a lesson he desperately needed to learn. Jasmine's story continued to inspire long after the incident was forgotten by the headlines. She became a role model for people who felt overlooked, showing them that quiet strength could achieve great things. Her name became synonymous with dignity and courage, and her legacy lived on in the changes she helped create. People who met her often said that Jasmine had a way of making you feel seen. She listened intently, treated everyone with kindness, and always left them with a piece of wisdom they could carry forward. To her, it wasn't about fame or recognition, it was about making the world a little better, one step at a time. Sometimes, the strongest people aren't the loudest or the most obvious. They don't need to prove their worth to others because they already know it themselves. Jasmine Carter was one of those people, a woman who showed that respect isn't something to be begged for or demanded. It's something that should be given freely, to everyone, without exception. As Dean learned that day, you never know who someone really is or who they're connected to until it's too late. But perhaps the most important lesson was this. Respect isn't just earned, it's expected. And when it's given, it has the power to change everything.